So hello everyone, warm welcome from this session on decarbonizing cities, how to build coalitions and get people on board. I have the honor to moderate this session together with my colleague Simone Sandholz. We are both from the United Nations University, the Institute for Environment and Human Security, a think tank of the United Nations. Our institute is serving as the main research partner for Daring Cities 2020, and today is the last out of 3 sessions which are hosted by UNU EHS. Before we start, quickly some housekeeping rules. The session will be recorded and published on the Daring Cities 2020 website. To all our speakers, please check your mic is on mute when not speaking. And to the audience, you can interact with the panel via the chat box. And of course, we also have a Q&A box, which is available, and we will select as many questions as possible to address in the final Q&A round at the end of the session. So today's topic, very quickly, achieving a rapid global decarbonization critically depends on activating contagious and fast-spreading processes of sustainability transformations within the next few years. These transformations can not only consist of accelerated technological progress, they need to take into account social dimensions as well. Decarbonization, therefore, cannot be successful if it undermines social justice and security, and more than anything, it will require buy-in from the general population and influential actors. So today in this panel, we want to discuss which social intervention, social tipping dynamics in particular can be promoted, which in turn activate contagious processes of rapidly spreading behaviors, social norms, or even technologies. And if there are any concrete actor constellations or coalitions and intervention to induce these positive social tipping dynamics toward a rapid urban transformation for inclusive and carbon neutral society. And of course, we want to share and discuss ideas and inspiring practices on how to engage formal and informal urban actors and influencers, for example, through culture and art, etc. So now I have the pleasure to introduce this very exciting panel here today. So first we have Saskia Dassen, Professor of Sociology at the Robert Lynn Chair at Columbia University. We have Rogier van den Berg from the World Resources Institute, Marieke van Staden, she's working for ICLEI and the Bonn, now I have to look, in the Bonn, no, she's the director of the Bonn Center for Local Climate Action and Reporting. And we have Dirk Walutsky, the director and filmmaker. And at the end, we also have a video message from Lady Lord Mayor Natalie Nelms from Newcastle on the climate action plan of her city. So now I have the pleasure to introduce to you Saskia Dassen. No, sorry, before we start with Saskia, very quickly on our outline for today. We start with Saskia with some introduction statement on decarbonizing cities and engaging diverse actors, followed by Rogier van den Berg on urban labs as social incubators. And Marieke van Staden is going to talk about global partnerships, support local action for a just and inclusive transition. And Dirk Walutsky will talk about the role of film and art to trigger social ecological change in cities. So now I have the pleasure to introduce Saskia Dassen. So she's a professor of sociology at the Robert Lynn Chair at Columbia University in New York and a member of the university's Committee on Global Thought, which she chaired until 2015. She's author and editor of many books. The most recent one is on cities and war. And in addition, Saskia is a recipient of diverse awards and mentions, among them multiple honorary doctorates, the 2013 Principe de Asturias Prize in the Social Science, an election to Royal Academy of the Science in the Netherlands, etc., etc. She has also been a committed and influential participant in public debate, appearing in many journals, including The Guardian, the New York Times, the Le Monde, Die Zeit, among others. So we are very, very happy to have you here today, Saskia, and now I would give you the floor.
You can hear me. Okay, thank you very much. So I think we are in a very particular moment in our civilization. Let's just think of it mostly as a Western-shaped civilization. We are confronting the way we have not yet really confronted certain brutal realities of how we organized, we the West, we the dominant actors, I'm thinking. So I find that this emergence of the pandemic is really a quite interesting invitation for us to think, to take note of our destructions. You know, I'm sorry to say, but I'm so aware right now of how much we have destroyed and unsettled. Now, the whole question of the pandemic, which also enters into this picture, is a sort of signal that we overdid it, that we went too far, that we misused land, that we misused water and air. And so where are we at now? And what is it that we must engage to make this a more reasonable situation? Now, point number 2, we have all kinds of extraordinary innovations. I have spent quite a bit of time in cities around the world, which are far more advanced, say, than the cities that I live in New York and in London, in terms of knowing how to use the natural conditions of a situation, rather than just trotting in plastics and trotting in, stuff that we have made that is not always desirable. The whole pandemic question is also functioning, as I said, like a signal that we overdid it with our misuse of land, of water, of air. And it is an invitation, of course, to rethink our own condition. The virus is yet another actor that has entered our current period in very significant ways. Everybody, more or less, is talking, and certainly in certain parts of the world, is talking about the virus. These, to me, all of these elements that are both negatives, but also contain within them options that we have not used sufficiently, all these other modes of doing it, which, in small settings, there are all kinds of places. Certainly Europe is full of that, where things are being done properly, the use of natural elements, etc., the protection of water bodies, of plants, etc. The United States, and I would say South America also, they are more brutal. They are really, that is a kind of, I grew up there, so I feel free to talk about this. That is a kind of brutality that, for instance, I do not see in China. Many people say, in the United States, think of China as one of the most problematic, brutal, etc. I don't see it that way. But I have to watch out what I say when I am in the United States, because they really don't like hearing that. It's like China is truly a problematic element. Now, talking about the virus, we have coexisted with many viruses across time, across space, etc. There is something every now and then, this is not the first one, let's remember the one of SARS in the 1980s, when a virus emerges that unsettles our comforts, that makes us stand up and say, what the hell is this? That forces us to take notice of other actors, of other conditions that we sort of overlook. And so for me, then it becomes extremely important that we act on that. I see an emergent condition now that is that countries are closing themselves up a bit. That is sort of the mood, even though there is still a lot of transnationalism to make that closing up a challenge. Final point. the whole question of the brilliant engineering, the extraordinary discovery of how we could be less brutal with using the gifts that Mother Nature gives us, whether that has to do with how we build, whether that has to do with what we eat and how we prepare, how we get what we eat, etc. So when I look at our current moment, I say two things. One of them is I think we have entered a new epoch. But in complex systems like ours, especially systems that contain within them vast amounts of built up cement, in other words, huge buildings that we cannot just simply destroy. We have got to deal with them. So under those conditions, it is not easy to see that we may have entered a new epoch. It just all looks like it's more of the same, with a few little changes. And I want to insist that complex systems have a way of changing that is not necessarily going to be easy to understand and easy to capture, because these are systems that are often embedded. The new systems are often embedded in older configurations. We are more familiar with the older configurations, and we often don't worry about learning the new configurations. We delegate vast amounts, we the citizens delegate to specialized actors all kinds of knowledges that in the past we the citizens also took care of. We did learn, now we just delegate because frankly, there are so many intermediaries involved. It's almost impossible for us citizens to be in command knowledge-wise. I don't mean as in dominating, but to actually recognize all that is happening. So I am not apologizing here for us, the people, and how we have handled our growing ignorance about all kinds of innovations, many of them excellent innovations that we should be aware of, but it's almost impossible to be aware of all of that given our daily lives. So one question then that I have is, and there is perhaps an element of fantasy in it, but I do think that generations matter. Generations across time change conditions. I think we have entered a new epoch. We don't have a name for it, partly because as epoch, it is actually embedded in an extraordinarily complex set of older conditions that we cannot easily get rid of. So the challenge for us academics, for us researchers, for us people who really want to protect what is still left. Let's remember how much we have destroyed in terms of lands and water bodies and space, etc. So I mean ground space. I don't mean space in the in the stratosphere. So it is a challenge, and I think that this is a very particular moment. So we're quite aware we have extraordinary access to knowledge functions that in the past would have been very difficult to engage or to know about. And yet we are prisoners of so many conditions that we have across the ages created that we have quite a bit of a difficulty in sort of doing what the people who entered new grounds, like the frontier, the whole notion of the frontier, which had many negatives. But we cannot get ourselves there. But in fact, I would argue that we are confronting a moment that contains within it a new kind of frontier. It is not the frontier of invading other people's land. It is a frontier in terms of the amount of destructions that we have managed to execute and the lack of or an incomplete knowledge about what we must do. We, each one of us, and that is the difficulty, that our knowledge is vary enormously. There are so many vectors producing knowledge that we sort of lose the plot very easily. We don't know what is correct, what is an exaggeration, etc., etc. So we give up. I see that already in some of my students, for instance. These are young, brilliant, and really energetic, but they go for one particular set of issues because they cannot deal with a broad spectrum that is actually in play and that we need to work with. We need to work with it as many different actors engaged by it. But I do think that we have, on the one hand, an extraordinary concentration of new forms of knowledges. I just want to mention, for instance, the kinds of knowledges that Japan has produced. Extraordinary, how they have worked with all kinds of materials that we, for instance, in the United States, we just look at them as materials, basically. The construction industry is very regressive in that sense. When you look at how Japan has handled air, water, materials, land, completely different than how we in the United States have handled that, where it's just all one little thing, simple, etc., and we don't bother. So we can learn from quite a few of the countries that are in vanguard situations that really have, and again, Japan is one of the ones that I know the most about. And they have really done extraordinary things, partly because they had to, because it's a small land where they can live, because most of it is rocks. Most of it is stone and rocks, and of course water. So within that small space that they have engendered an extraordinary amount of innovations that are not about grabbing, about winning the competition, about being on top. No, they are about embedding life options via, whether that is via materials, via metals, whatever it might take. And that is where the West, certainly the Americas, Europe is much better, but the Americas it's like they are in another zone, mostly, not completely, clearly. I don't want to exaggerate here, but, and so how do we reach these powerful nations, like, let's just think the Americas, where you have so much bad construction, ignorance of what are the instruments we should be using when we build, or when we in whatever the needs that we have, and so for me it's an interesting moment. It's a moment where some countries, again, I see that with Japan, are thriving in terms of these new knowledge zones. What kind of glass to use when you build, what kinds of materials to use, what not to use, where the United States must be one of the most regressive, because they are still stuck with a certain type of builder who does not know about all the materials, or does not want to know about all the materials that have been invented. Now, there is so much more to say. I don't want to take up more time, but I would be very happy when we are in the questions period to answer some more questions. But again, I just want to leave us with this notion that there are many changes we need to engage in, and we can do it, but it will mean to undermine what are now some of the dominant existing firms and enterprises. This is certainly in the case of the Americas. Again, Europe is much better at opening up, at trying to discover, at wanting to know what are the latest innovations, than, say, the big builders in much of the United States, which are like the opposite. You know, these are two grand examples. One, how not to do it, the US, and the other one, how to do it, to a very large extent, Europe, Japan, and such. I don't know. I don't want to talk more because I know that we have very short little periods to speak, but I'm hoping that during the question and answer, we get a second chance to add a few more things. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you very much for your introduction. Yes. Okay. Are there right now some questions from the audience? I think no. Simone, no. I think then we would, or I give the word to Rogier van den Berg. Quickly on his biography, he's the Director of Urban Development for the WRI Ross Center for Sustainable Cities, where he actually leads the global programming on strategic urban planning, land use, urban resilience, and housing, data, and finance. He is an urban planning and urban development specialist, architect, former entrepreneur, and academic, who most recently led the UN Habitat's Urban Lab, the agency's multidisciplinary urban project and integrated planning facility, working with over cities and partners worldwide. Thank you for coming, Rogier, and now he's going to talk about urban labs as social change incubators.
Thanks a lot, Geza. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks Saskia for this framing of this era. I hope a couple of things will resonate what you just said. Not all of it, but a couple of things resonate with it. I think the pandemic had a kind of a big personal impact on me. I was moving after 6 years of living in Nairobi to Washington, DC. So talking about kind of different continents and different places. And while kind of having bought a house on the other side of the Atlantic, I was stuck with my family in the Netherlands, in Rotterdam, where I come from. So just to give you a little bit of a kind of a framing of a condition, I'm kind of stuck in between continents, and really this framing that you just gave, Saskia, really resonates on how different societies work and utilize their materials and their kind of innovations. I want to talk a bit on how with the World Resources Institute, how we engage on the ground in experimentation through urban labs, with a question mark on if these can become social change incubators. I think we can discuss about that, because that has a lot to do with scaling and about amplifying, what you kind of achieve through urban labs. For the last 10 years, I've been working with this concept, working with communities, working on the ground, working in complex coalitions, different scales. And I want to share some thoughts that are, I think, relevant for this discussion. I think the pandemic made clear that the vision that we have with the Ross Center for Sustainable Cities on making resilient, low carbon, inclusive cities is more relevant than ever. We have this vision and we underpin it with our research and our projects. And we really believe that if one of these components lacks, there's no opportunity to thrive. So before I enter into kind of my elaboration on urban labs, I just want to give you a little bit of framing on this vision of ours. The second is in how we look at inclusion and the inclusive city. And this is very much based on the World Resources report. We have been working for the last 4 years on researching globally the accessibility of urban services in cities. And we truly believe that if you want to create transformative change and create kind of thriving cities, that equitable access to these services is key. We underpin this with many kind of many pieces of research, best practices, collaborating with partners and universities across the world. As I said, launching in the coming 2 months. And this really gives us a handle and gives us a direction and a guide on how to think through cities. And we could, of course, not anticipate the pandemic in which this inequitable access to cities has been on the front pages of mainstream media, with kind of the poor and the vulnerable facing the brunt of the pandemic, not having access to sanitation, not having access to affordable housing, not even have access to public space. And these are the assets of cities. So if you don't create these assets of cities, actually the city is useless. So I absolutely do not agree with the idea that cities are from the past. Cities will thrive in the future, but only if we create this accessible, equitable access to services. Otherwise, it's no use to be there. It's actually counterproductive to be there, which is kind of clearly now the case in the pandemic. So I could give you 1,000 pictures of engagement on the ground and projects, but I just wanted to touch upon a couple of points on that I learned after working in at least 60 different cities spread across the continents, working with urban labs. And urban labs are for me an essential building block for cities to allow experimentation and experimentation and bringing a new mix of ideas and coalitions into action. So that is the first point. The other point is that, that cities need these spaces to reimagine the future and to co-create and innovate. And that is not an abstract thing. So co-creation on paper is easier. It's quite easy to think about partnership and co-creation, but when doing it on the ground, you are confronted with the unexpected, with a lot of challenges around sequencing, when to bring in which partner, who to bring together. If you are part of these processes or involved as myself with organization on supporting cities in driving these processes, it's also a question, where do you position yourselves? Some of these labs are really driven by communities, others really need a push because there's a latent opportunity there. These urban labs, as I learned, to incubate social change, they can never go alone. I also really prefer urban labs above what is often called pilot projects. Pilot projects seems to be often much more an end in itself, while urban labs are about process, rethinking, reflecting, learning by doing, redesigning. It's a very much iterative design approach. And I'm trained as an architect, so I'm kind of excited by that. But the world in which we make our cities is very much dependent on linear thinking, and that's extremely dangerous and very difficult to use in order to kind of innovate. So once more, so only urban labs can incubate change if they really drive a process or go hand in hand with this kind of creation of common narratives. That idea of creating common narrative is much more interesting than the concept of advocacy. I think advocacy is somehow a sort of top-down approach. While creating this common narrative, you can do learning by doing, expose results to bigger audiences, and I'm very interested to Dirk's framing around that. So these are just two images that I borrowed from my former employer, UN Habitat, that I kind of deducted from many processes that I've been involved in. Urban lab as a space to kind of integrate vertical and horizontal, and this sort of kind of almost biology diagram of kind of iterative circles, different stages and processes that you engage in when you enter into that space of experimentation. And it's really kudos to the cities that allow these spaces to exist. And the most successful laboratories are when you combine, of course, physical spaces and physical change and experimentation on the ground with a kind of space in the city authorities where you can organize a coordinated and integrated approach to things. Okay, so that about urban labs. Then I wanted to spend two last slides on where I see key thematic areas for building new coalitions by using urban labs and other opportunities to create that kind of that scale and that transformation, as I've been talking about. First of all, the physical structure of our cities matter. Saskia already referred to it, but lately I have the feeling that urban planning is a dirty word, and it became a dirty word because it's done wrong. So an area-based approach, a community-driven approach, has a huge opportunity to reinvent how we engage in public space, how we think through mixed-use area development, how to use tactical urbanism approaches and campaigns, and how to create low-emission zones, improved air quality, and pedestrianization of the city. So we have to rethink how we plan and how we reshape our cities and neighborhoods. That is one thing, and a huge opportunity and challenge ahead of us, with 2.5 billion urban dwellers being added to the world by 2050. So this is a huge issue. And one of the biggest impediments for change is our land issues. And Saskia talked about land, but land is exceptionally complex, and especially in the developing countries where land is not registered, not coordinated, is in hands of families and tribes. So you can only resolve that issue by working through urban labs, by working through communities, and as such kind of influence and claim position in the dialogue with authorities. Second point is energy and building construction. I mean, it's so obvious and it's so difficult. So bridging the housing gap while creating low carbon communities. I mean, 1.2 billion city dwellers lack access to affordable and secure housing. That is unbelievable. If we're talking about access to services that I referred to related to our World Resources Report, this is the opportunity really to shape and reshape our cities. But if we approach housing as a quantitative matter, as just counting similar units in a similar fashion, it's going terribly wrong. So bridging that housing gap should really engage new partners to innovate and implement. Then last, nature. Nature. And this is not fashionable, this is urgent. And the pandemic has shown us how poor our cities provide us the green spaces that we want. I mean, a walk around the block with no tree in sight, it's terrible. So how can we really integrate nature into cities, foster water, nature, and forest in, but also nearby cities and conurbations? Because rapidly expanding cities really eat a lot of kind of our natural resources that are actually key to run our cities and to provide these services that I referred to in the beginning. And then this is my last slide. This is about if you kind of reinvent and experiment with these actors on the ground, it is very important. The key for new innovation and solutions is linking different actors together in order to kind of implement and change something really. That has to do with generation, as Saskia mentioned, and of different type of stakeholders taking part in creating movements and change. I want to mention four. I can mention many, but to mention four. Some experiences that we have is what we call City Fix Lab, where we bring young innovators and entrepreneurs, providing them access to the city and to capital in order to scale their innovations, new ideas, new technologies, but bringing them in as kind of renewers of kind of industries, using the city as a breathing space. The second is about youth leadership, so training the next generation of leaders, and we are piloting that in this kind of in the laboratories that we develop under the Global Commission of Adaptation, where we set up a long-term relationship between poor and vulnerable communities, cities, and universities in order to create locally grounded knowledge and locally enumerated data in order to provide communities a position and to own their data and knowledge in a negotiation and a discussion and a dialogue with the authorities. And this is direly needed because a lot of the poor and informal communities, they lack accurate data or they lack an understanding of the authorities on how their locally enumerated data is relevant in the policy space. The third point, or the third coalition, is Cities for Forest. This is for us a very important network of cities that is turning into a movement that is really fostering and driving the development and harnessing forests in nearby and far from cities. So it's very interesting that cities start to recognize their interdependence of this kind of natural assets, and that they use their own political, economic, and cultural power to protect them and manage them as part of the urban ecosystem. It involves residents' engagement and really is an opportunity to kind of spark a global movement of cities that care for forests, which is kind of turning it around. It's often a discussion from the national level down, or environmental agencies, but these are cities taking care of that kind of that wider figure ground that they're kind of entering into when growing and understanding these kind of key assets for their cities and their citizens. And the last but not least is this kind of coalition for urban transitions, which is the initiative that supports national authorities to understand how they can drive their economy and fight the climate crisis by intervening into cities. And this kind of national-local link is maybe very obvious if you look at kind of traditional planning, but how to make it work is really complex. And that is maybe the last point. If you look at kind of developing countries, cities have no budget to change and implement anything, not even nature-based solutions. So the question is, where do the resources come from? And there's a huge amount of domestic resources that should be made available to cities and their communities. And that is a very big challenge to overcome. Sorry to end on this kind of financing part, but it's something that we definitely need to kind of touch upon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rogier. It was really great following you on your examples and thoughts. And now I will give the word to our next speaker, Marieke van Staden. She directs the Global Low Carbon Strategy at ICLEI and is the director of the Bonn Center for Local Climate Action and Reporting. And she oversees the global programs and projects working closely with national and subnational governments on integrated climate action. And linked to this, Marieke also supports ICLEI global climate advocacy work. So now she's going to give a short statement on global partnerships supporting local action towards a just and inclusive transition.
Thank you so much, Keza. And thank you, Saskia and Rogier. I think you've said pretty much most of it. It's an interesting space. We're now responding to a global climate emergency, to a global pandemic, both of which pretty much were foreseen, but we were not ready, and we still are not ready to deal with such global crises. And it's an interesting space. Partnership, I think, is actually at the heart of where we need to expand our focus, and in particular, making sure that on the climate transition, we need to look at a just and inclusive transition. Nobody should be left behind. ICLEI, as you might know, has launched its climate neutrality framework last week during the Daring Cities conference, and it's embedded in our Green Climate Cities program. And through this climate neutrality framework, we call on and we guide subnational governments to set targets to go to carbon zero in greenhouse gas emissions, reduce emissions, but also our entry point is resilient development. We have to think of resilience as a starting point. And when we look at cities, towns, and regions around the world, the local and regional governments that lead and guide and administer these spaces need much more support. They need as much support as they possibly can get. And I believe the partnership space is exactly that, to enable them to work with them and support them. You might know that ICLEI has 5 pathways. So we follow 5 pathways as action areas, as entry points, essentially. But if you combine all of them, you could tackle climate change very effectively. And just think for a moment, when I now list these 5 pathways, who should be part of each pathway from a thematic and multidisciplinary perspective? Low emission development, nature-based development, equitable and people-centered development, resilient development, and circular development. We are talking about a massive multidisciplinary group of teams of people who need to support and engage to help our subnational governments design and implement their climate neutrality approaches. Now, okay, we know climate change is a very complex issue. Essentially, if there were no people on this world, climate change would happen and it would be fine. Now we have people, and this is about people, protecting people, looking at the generations Saskia mentioned, looking at innovative approaches. How can we design and shape people who would be influencers, who would help get and mobilize people? We have a system problem at the moment where people do not understand what they individually can do, what they as a family can do, what they can do within their corporate spaces, what they as a nation can do. Essentially, the information is all there, but the way it's communicated is maybe not so clear. So we clearly need more social disciplines as part of this conversation. We need to avoid overburdening and this infodemic where too much information is blasted at people and they don't know how to respond. And again, that needs reflection. How do we motivate and reward people to change and think differently, take responsibility for their actions? How do we leave no one behind and shape an inclusive and just transition? This is the space that ICLEI is active in. Through our Green Climate Cities program, we support local and regional governments around the world, regardless of where they are or the size of their community, to understand what their role could be in building partnerships and understanding who they should be working with. We teach them how to assess and define who to work with within their own governmental structures, because that's a good place to start. You don't only work with the thematic teams, you also work with the communications team, with the mayor's office, with your fleet team. There is so much to be done internally within your internal structures. Then you look at your citizens, your businesses, your industry. If they're not part of your community climate action plan, you will fail. So you need to bring them on board, and you need to give them a reason to be there as your partner. You need technical experts, you need your research and academia. And I think nicely, what Roger nicely alluded to, your different levels of government. No single government will be able to tackle the space alone. The government levels working together is also a partnership space. Thank you. Back to you, Geza.
Thank you very much. I think this was also a perfect bridge to our next speaker, Dirk Walutsky. Dirk Walutsky, as I said, is a film producer and director who has been mainly involved in many documentaries and series, recently in Searching for Ingmar Bergman and Check Check. For the German-American co-production Citizen 4 about whistleblower Edward Snowden, Dirk, together with Mathilde Bonnefoy and Laura Poitras, were awarded several international prizes, including the Oscar for the Best Documentary Film in 2015. For some years now, Dirk has also been working increasingly on topics of sustainability. For example, he has been involved in the short documentary series What is to be Done of the German-French television channel Arte. And now I'm very curious about what Dirk is telling us about the role of film and art to trigger socio-ecological change in cities.
Thank you, and thanks to all the wonderful speakers we just heard. Immediately, I, as a film producer, I always see everything in films. And you see that what Saskia mentioned, we have so much knowledge, and it's too much knowledge already, and the world is exploding, and science is exploding, and there are so many interesting and very optimistic and motivating paths into the future, like the labs that Roger did describe, and there are these urgencies Mareike was talking about, and so I think films do play an important role in communicating science. And I think as well that science has not done a very good job in the last 20, 30 years to really communicate the urgency of what is going on. Science often is hiding behind being diplomatic, being, oh, we are just advisors to the politic. We don't speak personally, and we know facts. Science is not about facts. Science is about the things that we don't know. We have all these kind of excuses for science, and I think that has to change. I think science has to really come up and to make this personal now. I had a very interesting moment a few days ago when I was when I was in the internet. I was clicking on this carbon watch that is in the internet, where you see the carbon budget that we have, and then you see just the rundown of a clock where the clock is running down. And you have in the upper left part, you have the 2-degree button, which says then, okay, we have 25 years. That looks okay, 25 years. Yeah, we might do something in 25 years. Then in the other, in the right corner, you have the 1.5 degrees button. If you click the 1.5 degrees button, all of a sudden the clock changes from 25 years to 7 years. So, and that is exactly the kind of moment that I would like to create in films, because we have this really dramatic urgency, and I am doing these kind of films, particularly short films. When I talk about films, I think there's a lot of really good documentaries in the last 10, 50, 20 years. Maybe it started with Al Gore and The Inconvenient Truth, who really raised a lot of awareness. But I remember myself and my wife, Mathilde Bonnefoy, with which I do all my films. We were at the time in 2006 in Los Angeles, watching that film in a movie theater. And we went out from the movie theater and we stood on the sidewalk in Los Angeles. And then we were totally flabbergasted, of course, by all these really depressing news about where we actually really are. And then we were watching all these SUVs go by, and we thought, well, there is no hope at all. We just should forget it. What we realized in that moment was that we were actually ready to do something, but the film, and that is the criticism of these films and these kind of films, which have their importance and their really important functions, but the film does not really give any kind of hope or any kind of answer to the questions, what can we do concretely as individuals to become part of the solution? Because the solutions are there, we know that. Science knows that, all the solutions are there. It's just a big problem of communications from science to actually the people, because science is always trying to influence politics, but the people are left behind, and politics doesn't do anything if people are not behind. So there's a lack of communication between science and the people directly. So in that moment, we came up with an idea of a series that we then produced in 2009. We started in 2010. It was with art. We developed 30 short films that we made. It's in a series that's called What's to be Done for a Sustainable and Just Future of Humanity. All these films are 10 to 15 minutes, and this was always one protagonist per film. And we had a really lot of very interesting people there. We had Dennis Meadows, we had Karl Ulrich von Weizsäcker, we had Susan George, we had Rob Hopkins from Transition Town Movements. We had a variety of 30 different people who were all just saying in 10 minutes exactly, they were following the same kind of structure in the film. The first was, what is our situation in general as humanities? What is the main problem? What are you doing? What is the protagonist doing? What are the solutions? What has society do? Society has to do. We always ended up with the answer to the question from this person, then what does the individual can do to become part of the solution? And I thought that these films are very important, and because the 10 minutes format was very good for universities, for schools. They are now a lot in universities and schools where people can have like 10 minutes and then you can discuss these films. What we are actually doing now is, because of what Saskia said, there's too much knowledge. Even young people lose oversight and there's too much disinformation. There's too much whom can we trust, and what kind of information can we trust. And there's we are actually starting a project that is called shortfilmsforfuture.org, and that is where we want to produce and show and curate short films that are based on the best insights from science, and which are giving motivating, showing motivating ways into the future. And this is particularly interesting because we are working as well on a project now with IKI, where we're going to accompany this project, which is about building coalitions in cities and how to bring the cities in the next years to be CO2 neutral. And I think that short films can explain very effectively the actual findings of science. They can, of course, then as well be more artistic, and they can transport a lot of emotions where people can connect to, and you can show them in circumstances in bookstores or in community centers, and you can have discussions about it. Well, that's why I think short films are a very good tool for this change as well in cities. So that would be, for the beginning, what I have to say.
Okay, thank you very much, Dirk. I think this was also very interesting, and I think for most people working in the field of urban development, kind of a new perspective. And I think this is also something we need to talk about, what kind of new perspectives, ideas we can really bring in to come up with also social change processes. First of all, I would like to come back to Saskia and also a little bit to all the others. Most of you actually started to reflect on the corona pandemic. And it is very clear that the pandemic is at the moment one of the main issues everybody is talking about, what Saskia said. And however, many people have started to think about how actually they want to live in the future with, or hopefully one day without the pandemic, and how they imagine their urban life. So in this sense, Saskia, you also said that already a little bit like this, the virus is an actor, is a driver of social change. And at the moment, we do not really know where things go, but what is kind of clear, okay, there will be probably also something like a transformation triggered by the virus. However, what would be interesting for me now is to know what actually can we learn from the fight against the corona for the fight against the climate crisis. So is there already a lesson we've learned? Is there something, yeah, so this would be my first question to Saskia.
Very nicely put. I really like the way you described that. I mean, first, I think that we right now are living a condition that is happening in most of the world, not everywhere in the world. But that is quite exceptional. Many of the major crises we have had in the West stayed a bit in the West. This is something else. So it is an invitation. And really, when I say it is an invitation, I'm really talking about a whole broad array of conditions that are inviting us to think more globally. I don't necessarily like this language of globally, you know, it's sort of so overused, but something that really is affecting all of us. There is no escape. There is no paradise where the rich can simply go. And actually, there still are some paradise where the rich can go. We know that. But we are really getting there to the point where we will be running out of that as well. So there is a kind of a, I don't want to use the language global moment, but I can't think of a better word. But something that is partial, but that embeds itself, has the capacity to embed itself into all kinds of different conditions in this planet that we inhabit. And there is something different. There is something new. Now, number two, I also think that the big, strong countries, you know, that and that is Russia, and that is the United States, and that is, you know, these very big countries that occupy a vast amount of space, you know, that they are an obstacle. You know, a lot of little countries, think of Europe. Europe has a lot of smallish countries, and they do the most with what they can in those smaller countries. And they're doing much better than a country like the United States, than a country like Brazil, than, you know, a whole bunch of other countries also, I would say, in the East. So it is sort of an invitation for us to think in this moment, this particular moment, when we have destroyed X, Y, Z, etc., and we are, however, now recovering some other range of, you know, set of conditions. What is it that is urgent? What is it where we have to simply stop talking and doing it? You know, we have, there is, and I think that the young generations, I find my students, etc., they're just wonderful. They are so ready, you know, it's no longer just, oh, I want to write the best book. No, it is, I want to solve that problem. I want to, you know, do something that enables the poor, blah, you know. So it is a very special moment in terms of kind of energy, an energy geared towards the social and geared towards social justice and what is viable. And in there hangs also not destroying the environment when we can avoid destroying it. Mind you, we are always going to be destroying, but do we have to destroy as much as we're destroying now? That is, I think, the issue. So I better stop because I could just go on and on this.
Thank you very much. As you just mentioned, especially like your young students are being very enthusiastic right now. Actually, my question would be for Marieke and also for Rogier. What is your impression? These youth movements, like we have Fridays for Future, in the US we have the Sun movement. So, what is the role of these youth movements for policymakers?
Well, I think if you look at Fridays for Future, it's an interesting evolution to see where it started and how it grew and how fast also the young people mobilized. I don't know, I find it fascinating we need leadership. You need people like the Gretas of the world to step forward. And there are many young people who actually are activists in this space who see that the tempo of change and that the planning stage, which has to include them, isn't happening fast enough. Of course, young people are quite often intemperate in the sense they want things moving now. They want to see rapid progress, and the space around politics is slow moving. Typically, you have a system where you have an election cycle and then 3, 4 or 5 years where some things happen slowly as per the political party that has won the election in a democratic society. That tempo doesn't work for young people. They want faster paced decisions and movements, and essentially what they want is what we need. We are moving too slow on the political front to respond to the demands of planning how we're going to deal with this transition. The transition has already started, whether we know it or not. The transition has to be planned, however, and it needs to be inclusive. If we're going to do this properly and make sure that we protect the planet, the people, the place we live and work in, that planning has to scale up drastically in partnership with many, including the young people. And frankly speaking, we can even bring in the kindergarten kids into this conversation, because they know what a good quality of life looks like. They have very clear parameters and things what they wish to see. That is essentially quality of life. You want to have a warm or cool, depending on where you are in the world, happy home. You want to have food on the table, and you have something to drink, and you want clean air to breathe and a nice place to play outside. We all want that. And that is the overlay we need to bring into the climate discussion. Back to you, Geza.
Thank you. Back to Rogier on the question of movements and
I want to say first something on that first question, and I will get to the youth later. Right. I mean, for me, really, the pandemic has really shown us that, you know, if cities go, so goes the planet. I mean, I've been working for 30 years. I'm actually a little younger than that, but let's say I'm fascinated for 30 years. I've been working for 22 years in urban space. I have never seen a mainstream newspaper talking in depth on issues of density on the front page. So it's just unbelievable, but it's also really an alarm bell, and that says we need to reinvent cities. So I totally do not believe in the demise of the city. We have coped with many pandemics in the past. You know, the beginning of the 20th century, the beginning of the 19th century, all pandemic, and after, cities have been able to kind of reinvent themselves. But this is really an alarm. The 11th hour. We need to rethink. So that is, I mean, I think everybody got that. But we also have seen, and that is really painful to see, because as Saskia referred to, that there are still places to go to for some people. But we've also seen, for most of the people, or for many people, especially for the poor and the vulnerable, there is no choice. There is no choice to run for the pandemic, to run for hazards and risks. So I think that is a thing that we need to take into account very, very seriously. And I come back to this to the access to services. So people are just being put outside of society, having no access to healthcare, having no access to sanitation, having no access to housing, having no access to clean air. You know, most informal settlements are actually built in along highways and roads, and so this is a very, very, very entrenched issue that we need to resolve. Rethinking cities and rethinking cities in the light of equity, and there youth comes in, because youth, I mean, training the next generation of leaders is key. And I just recall when I was leading, when I was head of the urbanism department of the Amsterdam Academy of Architecture, for an international collaboration, I went with my students to Brazil to work on an informal settlements. And they said, I asked them, what did you learn? And they said, we were so surprised that we flew half the world, but actually the people from Sao Paulo, our students, never went to these informal settlements either. So that means that if the next generation is not aware of, let's say, the way we have to look at cities and how cities are being managed or not managed, and what is the city? The city is not excluding, the city is inclusive of all these types of environment and these different people. If they are not aware of that, it's impossible to think that anything big is going to happen, anything is going to change drastically. So youth is key, and then I come back to that, to what I wanted to say about labs, and that labs provide the entry points for new coalitions and experimentation, and youth and students and universities should have access to big challenges, working with committed partners on the ground, preparing them for a kind of a huge task ahead. Over to you, Beda.
Sorry, okay, thank you very much, Rogier. Dirk, you probably, I mean, I don't know if you worked ever specifically with youth, but what would be your opinion on the strategic integration of specific actors, could be the youth or anything else you could think of?
Yes, the series that I mentioned, the What is to be Done series, that was actually aiming, and we always told our protagonists that we please talk to 16-year-old people. Imagine that you're talking not to the camera, but to 16-year-old people, because actually I believe only in the youth. I actually believe in children, and that we have to raise children completely different than we usually do in the last 10, 20 years. I have a 2-year-old son, and I see that already there in the first 2 or 3 years, you lay the fundament of how these beings are going to deal with the problems and the future, and what a human being is, and if they are self-confident enough to really attack these big problems. So I think, yes, youth is for me the only address that I would concentrate on, and particularly now, where we have a youth which obviously is interested and is different and is willing to do something, but and they demand leadership from science, not from politics, which I think is really good that they do that. So now science really has to step in there and help these youth to really give them the information that they need, and then to make together with the youth the pressure that is needed for the politics.
Thank you, Dirk, very much. I have like one last question from my side before we go to the Q&A from the audience. Because I'm not wondering, because it's clear like time is always kind of a main issue. So time is a main issue for the youth now, asking for rapid and radical change. Time, by the way, is also something we can observe by the Corona crisis, because suddenly we actually see, and we all, yeah, we see, and it's done like, okay, societies can change very radically, very quickly. Yeah, like last year, no politician would ever have said this could be possible. But still, while fighting the climate emergency, I think the time problem is not solved. So time is still an issue, and these kind of needed radical changes are far away. So even with all the examples we heard, my question would be, is this sufficient enough? Is this fast enough? So I don't know if one of you would like to answer this kind of tricky question of how to accelerate actually change processes.
I think, Geza, I would be happy
Yes,
to start that conversation, because I think even using the term climate emergency, people find inappropriate or scary. Even people in the space feel that it's too threatening. So this is also the Daring Cities series. This whole event was conceptualized about the fact that we are dealing with a climate emergency, and the word emergency means act now. And we're showing a diversity of things that are already happening now, which means we know what to do. And all we need is, not all, but what we need to do is scale up. I think the COVID, if we could look at COVID-19 again, and how there were responses to the pandemic, which in my view sometimes were even counterintuitive and not supporting the community, especially people who needed, for example, to get on public transport, to go to just get to do shopping. Public transport just stopped. So how could they get food? These things, we need to think about the impacts of our actions. And I think that's where local and regional governments in particularly, when they are now thinking about dealing with a crisis, the planning component and the partnership component has to be fully defined now. We need to scale up fast, but we can't do this alone, as I mentioned before. So defining what you want to do, bringing in your young people into the conversation, your old people into the conversation. The elderly are also a vulnerable group that needs to be part of this. The people who might be losing their jobs because we're going to move away from fossil fuels need to be part of the conversation. That is called just and inclusive in the transition planning. And then, of course, moving as fast as we can in areas to reduce emissions. If you look at governmental operations, we can change things in the next year immediately, where you switch to 100% renewable energy. There's nothing that speaks against that. You just need to either become your own energy provider, or you buy local renewable energy from a local source. These are the kinds of easy, fast steps that anybody can do and look into. There are, of course, more challenging and much more complex areas and problems which need more conversations and a co-design of what that transition could and should look like. And that's exactly where the leadership is needed. We need leadership in all sectors of society. We need leadership in all levels of government to move forward and plan together. And again, also, you don't take it city by city. You look at your city and you look at your neighboring towns, districts, other cities. Do it together. Don't think that you're alone in this space. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anyone else? Dirk, I think you have some specific ideas on, and Saskia afterwards.
Yes, I think that what Saskia said at the beginning as well, that the corona now, the corona epidemic might make a difference, and I think we should use it, because the corona, I listened to the radio a few days ago, and somebody was saying that what actually did we learn from corona? That all the stuff that we can buy and all these things that we all normally think that is so important and which are in our lifestyle included because we are seduced to think that this all is important, all that all of a sudden is put into question. And all of a sudden the question is, what does really matter? And then you see relationships matter, you need friends, you need access to what you can cook and eat, and you need social possibilities to have friends. And all of a sudden we are in this existential crisis. And I think if we do not use this existential crisis now to really speed up all the processes and to make scientists come forward and to really underline or in what a difficult situation we are and how late it is already. I mean, 7 years for 1.5 is nothing. And if that is not the moment now to really try something much more radical, I don't know when it should be. And I think that is, it's really important that we act now and that we come out of our comfort zones. And then that we have this, these wonderful new plans from the Wuppertal Institute, which says 1.5 is feasible by this and this technical solutions. But we have to talk about what that actually means for the life that we lead. We have to talk about that it's not without a radical change of our lifestyles. It's not without that we in the Western world reduce our activities, reduce our consuming and consumption. That there will be reductions that we have to do. And I know the Green parties don't want to hear that, and they want to talk about the green, the new green economy and green growth. And so I think we should talk seriously now that this is not the way it's going to happen. And I think we should have the courage, and we should use this momentum of the epidemic now to really talk about truths that we are scaring away from, were scaring away from in the last 10 years.
Okay, thank you very much. Saskia, you wanted to say something.
Unmute. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, sorry. So a lot has been said, and I agree with everything. I can't help it. I agree with everything. But one way of thinking about it is the question of enabling. So enabling old people to be part of the discussion, enabling children, young children, enabling youth, so a whole range of different enablements, some very local, some that could be quite international, etc., etc. How can we as communities, and that really comes down a bit to the neighborhood, to the institutions of a city or of a neighborhood, how can we enable the young also and the old? In the middle, you have these sectors where they are desperately trying to make enough money to feed all the children they have, and etc. But at the edges, the young and the old, you have whole worlds of time that could be used in ways that are a bit more complex, let's say, than how they're used now, which is, visiting the neighbors or playing with the other kids on the block. So that kind of notion, who are the people right now in our cities, in our neighborhoods, who would love to participate? Now, I don't have a clue. I live in a huge city, Manhattan and London, my two cities, and, I will know how to start. But this notion that locality after locality contains people who would love to become participants. And I really think of the young and of the old, because in between, those people are too busy, taking care of the old and the young. But anyhow, so I just wanted to add to all the marvelous things that have been said. And I now have to check out. I apologize, but I have to teach a class.
Okay, all right.
There's no escape.
Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much to be here. And so I think my question would have been, what's about the middle part, who's probably the most influential, but maybe one of the other speakers can take that one.
Sorry, I guess, can I say something just on this acceleration? Because
yes, please.
It's a very important question, and it's really now we are facing the urgency. We are aware. We have the data, we have the innovations and the technology. So how to do it? I think there's a huge question around devolving mandates and resources. So a lot of kind of slowness in the processes and in how things are governed is that they're still way too top heavy. So bringing down more responsibilities to cities closer to the people is very important. I mean, I've been working with cities for so long, and good ideas, good projects, they simply cannot be funded from local resources only, not at all. No single successful city in the world has done that before. So we really need to kind of devolve mandates and resources. That is really important, and that comes to the next question, that requires national governments to step up and to give away some of these authorities, and in order to be more agile. And I think agility, we have not touched upon that, but it is super important, because not every city is going to be affected in the same way now and in the future. So that is I think very, very important thing. And the other thing is that, and that relates to that, let's say, devolving these authorities and resources, is that I've seen so much good energy in projects, innovations on the ground, communities and collaborations, partnerships. So we need to invest in them. They are key. But often it kind of, the implementation gets stuck because there's somehow a missing link. So, I mean, as I said, if these urban labs or partnerships or new coalition operate in a vacuum, it's going to go nowhere. There's only a few communities who have the bandwidth and the energy to go after their aim forever, you know? So at a certain moment, there has to be some kind of payback, some results, some implementation. And this is why it's so important to, you know, to sit close to where the initiatives are, to invest in these partnerships and to devolve authority and resources. And I truly believe that creates much more of a kind of networked reality. But there is the solution. There is really the solution for acceleration. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very, very much, Rogier. I think now I would like to give the word to Simone, and I think she has a couple of questions from the audience.
Yes, and we have very limited time, so many thanks for all the questions we received from the audience, and I will now try to merge some of those so that we can at least answer a couple. So there were quite some questions around a topic which had already been tackled about how to ensure that any change is just and inclusive and not only meant for certain groups of society, and then usually the ones which are maybe better off anyway. So the question would be, many approaches are rather exclusive. We've seen that under COVID and in many countries. So and on the other hand, for groups which are anyway vulnerable and marginalized, they might even have other priorities compared to, I mean, like getting sustaining their daily lives instead of fighting climate change in the long run. So what's your ideas? Would you have any examples from your past experience how you made that work to guarantee that approaches are inclusive, and how can just an inclusive urban transition be guaranteed while we're even facing governance challenges which are still very much in silos and not as transformative as we've been talking now? So maybe we start from Marijke because she was nodding, and then Rogier can add if he wants.
Thanks, Simone. I think that's such a critical question. Typically, we encourage the subnational governments to first map who are in their territories vulnerable, marginalized, poor, at risk in any particular way. And of course, this would be different if you deal with heat waves versus if you deal with flooding. So you need to actually look at all your risks and vulnerabilities in your community, and then discuss with them. I think people are, of course, interested in staying alive and interested in moving forward with their lives. So the challenge we have now is many of the vulnerable groups. Let's take poor people in a city like Delhi, people who do not necessarily have access to water and sanitation. If we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, everybody should in the future, and ideally soon, get access to clean, safe, secure, basic services, which includes also then housing, sanitation, access to water, access to clean energy. We need to bring the SDGs together with our climate action plans. That will actually make sure that our vulnerable groups are definitely going to be dealt with. If you know who they are, you've reached out to them and spoken with them to explain to them how they would need to be part of the co-design of this solution, then you would probably get traction. People want to be respected, whether they're rich or poor. And if we go in with a perception of respect and with a perception where you want to listen to them and not talk to them the whole time, but invite them to share their perspectives, perceptions, ideas, and making sure that their thoughts are part of your future planning, and that you constantly stay in touch with them to make sure that they're up to date on what is happening, that they feel included. I think that's an important component. And that is clearly the role of the subnational government, to be part of that, to stimulate that conversation.
Here, any additional thoughts on it? Maybe also focusing on that challenge within governance being siloed in different sectors, but also levels.
Yeah, well, I think I said quite a bit on that, that these linkages are important, that devolving authorities and resources and you know, using this kind of experiment to kind of really reinvent these kind of relationships. So I think I'm very interested, of course, in that question of inclusion, and so it is I think it's the wrong take on decarbonization to kind of decouple it from the key benefits from good cities. So Marijke told earlier, everybody wants a good house, wants public space, etc., etc. These are all linked to decarbonization issues. So these are not separate things. So we need to kind of reinvent and recreate and co-create our cities. We need to plant trees. We need to build parks. We need to build public spaces, affordable housing. You know, that is all needed to create better lives for people. And it comes down to the point I made earlier. Our World Resources report, the issue of kind of equitable access to services, as Marijke already indicated. That should be the core question. And through that, you can pretty much have an entry point to decarbonization everywhere. So, and as I said already, and as many have echoed, the technology innovation, we know how to do it and we can finance it. It's not a question about that. To give you one example, you know, I mentioned energy and building construction. You know, the major barriers to efficient buildings are institutional and behavioral. They are not at all technological or financial. So we can overcome these issues and really create better cities for all. And but it requires the leadership to step up and do it, and not. I mean, in many data enumerations in cities, the informal sector and informal communities are not included in the city assessment. Well, then if you don't even have that, it's impossible to change business as usual.
Many thanks. Dirk, as time is running, I would have a different question to you that was raised. Earlier, you said there's a lot of knowledge already available. There's a lot of science, but it has to be communicated. And over the past years, many new concepts emerged, like the transformation we've been talking about now for a while. Donut economy was just raised in a different question as a novel example on how to link planetary boundaries to social boundaries and so on. However, they are quite complex. So one very concrete question that Carlos raised was, would you have from your art perspective some very concrete example or a suggestion how such complex thinking could be mainstreamed and could be broadcast, could be transmitted to the audiences to solve sustainability challenge?
Yes, there are, of course, all kinds of different ways to deal with that. There are, for example, really good short films, particularly animated short films, which are really good to describe very complex problems and to really nail it down to very understandable short films. Then art, for example, that is, of course, the idea of art is in a way to use another language than the language of science or our everyday language. And art does exactly that. It brings down very complex feelings and questions to a very surprising, clear point. That is not what I would call mainstream, but I think there is not the one solution that fits all. We all have to do whatever we can, and artists have to do theirs, filmmakers have to do theirs, and I think particularly we need to create these even very, very short films that when we talk about use, where can we actually get use at the moment. That is not in television. That's not in this documentary. It's about 90 minutes or so. There you're praying to the choir. That's people who go in cinema looking for the next depressing film about the latest research, even for motivation. People go there because they are already interested. But we have to go to all these places in the internet where use is, and this all has to be politicized. This all has to be through art and through short films and through little remarks and statements. We have to be there. And it's not the one film that can do it all. Everybody who is an artist or a designer or graphic, everybody can make films today. If you would think about like 20 years ago, film was something that nobody could do. Now you have an iPhone and you can really produce highly professional films. With only an iPhone, you can even edit there. And that means there's a lot of possibilities opening, particularly for people who were not included in all these kind of processes. And I think we all have to become part of this process and communicating and discussing. And this has to be where everybody has to do exactly what he or she needs to do. But now, that's...
Dirk, thank you very much. This was kind of already the closing remarks. I couldn't have put that nicer than you. So we all have to do something, and we all have to take action now. And I think today we listened to quite a lot of examples and ideas. And I think this is something each of us needs to also think further and come up with new ideas, own ideas, to fight the challenges of these days. So at this point, I would like to thank all the panelists very much for your contribution. I think it was really very exciting, interesting discussing with you today. And as I said at the beginning, we have now a video presentation from Lady Lord Mayor Nguyen from Newcastle City in Australia on the climate action plan of the city. And I highly recommend to watch this video because it's really incredible what this city already achieved. Thank you very much. Also, thank you very much, Simone, and also the technical backup from ICLAI to supporting the session. And now I wish all of you, have fun with the video and say goodbye.
Nuatali Nelms, Lord Mayor, City of Newcastle, Australia. Thank you for having me as part of Daring Cities 2020. I'm going to give you a brief overview of our journey over the last 8 years around decarbonising our city and bringing the community along with us, as well as building strong coalitions. We're right in the thick of it at the moment, building a strong coalition to adopt our climate action plan for 2025. So this is a really great time to be talking to you about decarbonising our cities. I'm also a member of ICLAI's Oceania Regional Executive Committee, as well as chair of the GCOM Oceania Steering Committee. And that has been a great privilege working with other cities and councils in the Oceania region. 8 years ago, we started developing our plan that has just completed this year, and we set targets around our own electricity use here at the City of Newcastle, as well as our electricity supply, as well as a reduction in our carbon footprint. And we've met and exceeded all of those targets over the last 8 years. We embarked on a program of installing renewable energy systems, particularly solar, here in quite a sunny city in Newcastle, Australia, on a lot of our facilities. And as you can see, there are quite a different amount of sizes of systems, as well as the amount of electricity generated. We've also constructed in the last 2 years a 5 megawatt solar farm for our own electricity supply. That supplies about half of our needs here at the City of Newcastle. That was constructed on an old landfill site at our Waste Management Centre, which was once a coal mine. This has been operational over the last 12 months and has provided significant operational savings here at the City of Newcastle, as well as decarbonising our city. Also, we have shifted to 100% renewable energy for our electricity supply. So this was part of a broad community engagement program and done with broad community support. We were one of the first councils in Australia and the first council in our state in New South Wales to move to 100% renewable electricity for our own energy supply. We looked at our average daily consumption profile, and in doing so, going through that process, wind renewable energy was the best match to match with our rooftop solar arrays. And that was the contract we entered into with Flow Power. And now I can proudly say that all of our operations here at the City of Newcastle are 100% renewable energy powered, which is a really good outcome. Obviously, there's a lot of work behind the scenes, and I'll happily share all of this detail with you. And this basically gives you a timeline of us taking actions to reduce our emissions using 2008-9 as our baseline, and obviously working through that process, installing rooftop solar, looking at our smart cities, looking at our transport and electric vehicle charging stations, as well as powering those electric vehicle charging stations with solar, right up to 2020, when we now have our 100% renewable energy supply, as well as our Summerhill solar farm generating 7.5 million kilowatt hours of renewable energy each year. And as I said, that's enough to power more than half of the City of Newcastle's annual electricity needs. This is some of the solar array we have, and this is the stats that we have achieved as a result of a plan over the last 8 years. As you can see, it's the 100% renewable electricity supply, reduction in water use, and reduction in electricity use in general, but a 77% reduction in our carbon emissions. But obviously there's more to do. So part of that process we've been going through this year is developing our climate action plan, which has been through community consultation and is based on our Newcastle environmental strategy, and also a very key component of our plan 2030. We're looking at mitigation as well as adaptation here at the City of Newcastle. So coming at dealing with climate change from both angles. At the moment, we're looking at bringing this final climate action plan back to the elected council after community consultation. It is in line with the net zero plan and the first stage of that plan, which is the New South Wales government plan, looking at different technologies, as well as making sure that consumers and businesses are making sustainable choices, also, just like we have done at the City of Newcastle, leading by example, as well as making sustainable choices. We are also very proud of making sure that the Sustainable Development Goals are a focus of the City of Newcastle, and that they are also a focus of our community strategic plan, and they are well socialised with other community groups as well as business leaders in our community. This is looking at our updated emissions profile, which is forming part of the baseline for our 2025 climate action plan. This is our electric vehicle charging station that is powered by rooftop solar. As you can see, this is tracking our pathway to net zero operations and emissions. For us, in our own operations at the City of Newcastle, we're looking at the significant reduction, obviously, of our own electricity use, particularly through that 100% renewable contract. We're looking at a changeover of the street lighting to low emission sources and LED lighting. And we're also significantly looking at phasing out our reliance on fossil fuels through our transport network. And that's going to be a major component of our plan over the next 5 years. As you can see, our net zero emissions no later than 2030. These are our targets, 20% reduction again in electricity use, 100% of lighting to be LED, a 50% reduction in our fuel use, and a 50% reduction in carbon emissions on top of what we've already achieved in the last 8 years. 100% renewable energy supply, and that is looking at how we can continue to source all of our electricity as well as do on-site generation. We're also doing a business case at the moment for battery storage to complement obviously our solar farm and that generation. We're also looking at best practice energy, water and waste efficiency for all of our facilities and our operations here at the City of Newcastle. And this is also driven by a lot of community support and demand for these projects. We're also very interested in making sure we're looking into our supply chain, really working on the circular economy, particularly around utilising recycled glass, aggregate and other recovered materials, particularly in the construction of road base, for example. We're also looking at how we identify and implement opportunities to utilise recycled plastics in our street furniture, posts in playground and other infrastructure we provide for the community. We're looking at the removal of all single-use plastics from our operational activities. And we're also working with local businesses to trial, develop and implement low emissions materials and technology. We're part of a broad network of signatories to the Sustainable Development Goals, both through the community and industry here at the City of Newcastle. One of the key components of our climate action plan over the next 5 years is definitely looking at zero emission transport options, particularly in our own fleet. But Australia has quite a low uptake of electric vehicles, for example, and how we can actually make sure we're encouraging active transport with cycleway lanes, bike parking, end-of-ride facilities in our office blocks, as well as making sure we're promoting the take-up of electric vehicles for consumer use as well as business use, and looking how we're going to transition our fleet over where we can to electric operations over the next 5 years, which is quite a large undertaking for this council. So we're also, part of this is looking at the snapshot here of being able to reduce our community emissions in part of our residential, commercial and industrial emissions, and not just our own operations at the City of Newcastle, and how we can inspire and lead other businesses and community members to look at their own emissions profile and how we can assist with their transition over to low carbon sources. So what we're really aiming for is a net zero emission city, and that's around clean technology, electric transport future, as well as advancing net zero emissions industries across the whole supply chain, from that startup idea through manufacturing as well, and supporting our local manufacturing sector here, which we're known for here in the City of Newcastle, and making sure we have that end-to-end supply chain that does ensure jobs are maintained and created with this transition here in not just the City of Newcastle, but also in the Lower Hunter. This is our objective around resilience and the emissions to ensure a cleaner and more sustainable future. And that's looking at every facet, the low emissions development, as well as how we encourage the take-up of clean technology, which we have done ourselves, as well as building a low carbon circular economy through a number of those measures that I've mentioned previously. So this is the targets we're looking at, particularly working with other levels of government, as well as power generators and the owners of a number of the power networks, as well as neighbouring councillors and electricity retailers, to make sure There are charging stations for electric vehicles on both on and off-street parking, as well as making sure the transport as well as fleet and freight operations are also reducing their emissions here, and advocating for electric buses, ferries, taxis and delivery trucks here in the city of Newcastle. We also, as you would have noticed probably from a previous photo, have a very active working harbour. So we're looking for the creation of renewable hydrogen and ammonia export hubs, as well as a regional bioenergy hub and green metal and mineral processing here in Newcastle. So we're actively promoting Newcastle as a clean tech innovation hub and an international test laboratory for the best practice carbon and water reduction technologies and services for the national and international markets. So we're looking at how we can expand on the last 8 years of the achievements we've made within our own operations, working with the community and business to expand that to all facets of daily life here in the city of Newcastle. For more information, you can have a look at our website, which is newcastle.newsouthwales.gov.au. And I appreciate, again, the opportunity to be part of Daring Cities 2020. I think all the work that you have all been doing across the world is, giving us all hope that we can get some real action on climate change. I know it's been a real struggle, but cities really are leading the way, and I'm really proud that the city of Newcastle is one of those cities. Thank you. Bye.